Well, good afternoon. I'm Damarius Johnson. I'm conducting another author interview for the Picturing Black History project with Dr. Lichtenstein. Wondering if you could just introduce yourself, your research, and your professional affiliations, please.
Sure. Thank you, Damarius, and thank you to Picturing Black History. It's really a pleasure to do this. I teach American history and South African history, as a matter of fact. I'll explain that in a minute, at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I've been here about 11 years. I'm now the chair of the American Studies Department. And broadly speaking, throughout my career, I've looked closely at the formation of and resistance to white supremacy in the US South, especially the rural South, which is where the Picturing Black History assignment came in. But about halfway through my career, I went on a Fulbright visit to Cape Town, South Africa, and spent 9 months there, and really found, I was there actually on the premise that understanding what was going on in South Africa 6 years after the end of apartheid would be comparable perhaps to what was going on in the American South, say in the 1870s, that is after the abolition of slavery and the process of emancipation. So I was very interested in how society, once based on white supremacy, could reconstruct itself, essentially. I learned that and much more besides when I was there, and was so taken with the place that I started doing research in South African history. So in the second half of my career, I've both done comparative history in terms of comparing Reconstruction, the Black experience in the US and South Africa, some photographic history, which connected the photographer Margaret Bourke-White, who photographed the American South in the 1930s and then South African apartheid in the 40s and 50s, and other comparisons as well. So now very much I do US Southern history, comparative US South African history, and increasingly just the labor history of South Africa, which I found very interesting. So I've had a kind of peripatetic career, but I hope as we talk to Damarius, you'll see, and the audience will see how this photographic essay connects some of these dots.
Yes, absolutely. So as a Africanist myself, I'm certainly ears perked up when you mentioned South Africa. So I imagine we'll have a pleasant conversation here. But I'd like to know, if as a follow-up, if you could just talk generally about what you see as the purposes of studying history and how it can help us understand the present and future.
Oh man, well, that's a tough one. The purposes of studying history. Well, for me, I was never drawn to history just because I wanted to know what happened or out of some antiquarian interest, but really, I think I was drawn to it initially because I was compelled by the necessity of the struggle for racial justice in the United States in particular, but globally and in South Africa as well. That seemed like a compelling theme to me, that is to understand the society in which I grew up and in which I still live. I wanted to understand how it was, on the one hand, imbued with white supremacy in unfortunate ways, but on the other hand, was an inspiring story made up of and by the many people in US history and South African history who dedicated their lives to fighting racism and white supremacy. So those were the things that really drove me to investigate the past in order to better understand the present. So for me anyway, it was always very much a politically inspired endeavor. That doesn't mean I knew what the answers were, but I really have always felt that I, and then the people I teach, cannot understand how to grapple with the current problems in our society unless we know, where those problems came from and why they're still with us.
Absolutely. If you could talk more about why this is a particularly significant event or story.
Yeah, so when I had this Picturing Black History assignment, we get to choose some photographs, and I'd always been fascinated by the history of the rural South, particularly in the 1920s and the 1930s. One, because it's a visually well documented and arresting history, because the Farm Security Administration photographers fanned out across the country, but many of them focused in the 1930s on taking photographs of the South. I mean, these are many of the photographs we know well in Mississippi and Arkansas. Ben Shahn, who's the photographer I write about, Dorothea Lange, who wasn't just in California, but spent time in Mississippi, Arthur Rothstein, the Dust Bowl photographs. I mean, you just name any Farm Security Administration photographer, and one of the sort of places on their itinerary was almost always the rural South. Now, that was with the aim usually of documenting Southern desperation and poverty. That is the deep, deep poverty in which most Southern rural people, Black and white both, but Black especially, lived during the 1930s with a political purpose, which was to propagandize in favor of the various government programs that were designed to help those people. And that's an incredible, I mean, anyone who knows the history of photography knows that that was, one of the most stunning visual records in the 20th century that we have in US history. And moreover, in terms of African-American history, also a stunning visual record, which you can find, for instance, in the great book, More Urban, but also Rural, by Richard Wright and Edwin Roskamp, which was published from the FSA photographs, 12 Million Black Lives, I think published in 1940. So there's this important documentary history. All that said, I wrote this essay about Ben Shahn's Arkansas photographs because they do something a little different. And that's why they caught my eye, in that they don't really document, and he has pictures that do so, document the destitution of the Black poor in the rural South. That was easy to find. You didn't have to look far if you're traveling through these counties. But what struck me about the photographs that I write about, that you see in the essay, is they do something a little different, and that Shahn's eye seemed to be caught by something different, which was this resilient, vibrant, dignified, and self-determined Black life that persisted in the deepest Jim Crow South, rural Arkansas, a place where, as I say in the essay, no question that on a daily basis, African Americans were subjected to white power and white supremacy. And yet Ben Shahn caught this moment in which that, if not absent, was not visually apparent, and something else is going on in these photographs. And that's what I liked about this image, because in some ways it was so different than many of the other FSA photographs we see of Black life in the rural South from the 30s.
Sure. So I was wondering if you could talk more about that photographic archive. If having these images by Ben Shahn, does it shift the way that we understand the time period in terms of the lived experience of folks, or do you mean that it's significant because of the way that the photographer, the strategy of captured? This
really wasn't just a case writing about a different element to FSA photography, although it was that. But as Damarius is asking me, how does this shift the way we might understand life in the rural South in this period, especially for Black people? And again, that's the other thing that I found interesting about it, was that it demonstrated an aspect of Black life in the rural South that, we forget all too easily. This is a tension in doing African American history, of course, as we spend a lot of time trying to write about and demonstrate the conditions to which people were subjected, and necessarily so, especially in this day and age when, we live in a moment in which, it wasn't so bad, or, racism really was an aberration and not central to the American experience. So we're at great pains to document the fact that, well, no, racism was central to the experience, particularly African-American experience. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we demonstrate that people still lived lives, that they weren't always oppressed at every moment, and that they found the possibility for dignity and self-determination, not just through revolt, but through daily life and pride in their family, in their community, in their property, if they were landowners, and the aspiration to own land, and so forth. So to me, this isn't just evidence of a particular approach to photography that Shahn took at the moment that was a little different than his peers. He was also a painter. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it also, as Damarius asked, definitely makes us rethink or understand Black life in the sharecropping South in another way. And as I say in the conclusion of the essay, there were all sorts of good reasons to leave the South, economic, political, and so forth, but something was left behind, also something that may have been valuable to people.
Yes, well, since you mentioned it, could you please tell us more about the painting?
Well, I don't know Shahn's work as a painter all that much, but he was a painter first and foremost, not a photographer. The reason I bring that up is well, two reasons. One, he has a very interesting painting that he did on his way to this community in Arkansas to take these photographs, where he stopped in a town called Marked Tree, which is in the Arkansas Delta. And that was the heart of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the interracial protest movement in 1935 that was standing up for the rights of sharecroppers, both against their white landlords and against the government that was handing out government checks to the landowners when they should have been defending the sharecroppers. So Shahn, as far as I can tell, witnessed one of these protests and did an amazing painting of it, which you can find. And so I was interested, and yet when he gets to Little Rock and takes this set of photographs of this particular family, he's not paying attention to protest, he's paying attention to something quotidian, daily life on a Sunday. And yet I thought there was a connection, right? That is, the protest that explodes in the Delta is connected in some ways to the dignity and self-determination that he found just a week later when he gets to Little Rock. And secondly, I think Shahn is really important because there may be others, but I would say he's one of the few people of that generation that is socially committed and indeed politically radical photographers and artists from the 1930s who was a living bridge to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So even while in 1935, we can find this painting, these photographs, but also this painting by Shahn of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Then in 1964, he does this drawing, really powerful, I think, of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, the three civil rights workers who were assassinated essentially by the Klan in Meridian, Mississippi in 1964. So Shahn is aware of and creating visual records of both of those moments. And so to me, that makes him a particularly interesting figure in American arts.
Yes, thank you. And one theme that you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on was this idea of everyday protest. And in particular in the essay, as you focused on dress. And I wondered if you could talk about how dress signals resistance and how you were able to discern that in the image.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I can answer that one, Damarius. Right? So in the essay, I do emphasize the way people and the children especially are clothed, how they're dressed. In particular, again, the typical image that we get of the Southern Black sharecropper in the 1930s is dressed in rags, right? And yet Shahn captures these people on a Sunday. And again, I don't think this was an unusual moment. And there's a whole series of these photographs dressed in their Sunday best, right? And these are very poor people, but it's clear that they value their church going. I mean, that's part of the ritual, and that religion was a key element of their world. And that and carried with that was, again, dignity, self-respect, and respectability. I mean, I know there's plenty of good critiques of what's called respectability politics, but, in this time and place, the ability to demonstrate that, you could clothe your family as the patriarch of the family, the willingness, again, the other images that we don't have that I didn't put in the essay, but that are part of this series are of Black women standing outside the church on that same Sunday, very well dressed, very well dressed. So I, again, was struck by that, and that this being well dressed for the sharecropper's family represented, well, I would say two things. One, if they were expending money on clothes, this is, what they are spending money on. There is not a lot of extra cash in these families. So that seems significant. Or two, and here's where at least I didn't have the eye to detect this, but some of the clothing may be homemade, right? So that they buy cloth, and then this is something that the daughters and the wife of the family do is make these clothes, which again are designed for a time and a place and a ritual, which is this Sunday. The fact that it's a Sunday is very important. So that sort of sartorial politics, if you want to call it that, is very important in all sorts of ways. I mean, one certainly sees it in South Africa as well, in terms of both the dress of respectability, but sometimes alternated with what in the South African context would be called traditional dress. So that Nelson Mandela, when he shows up for the treason trial, sort of his first trial in the 1950s, he very deliberately dressed in traditional African dress to send a signal, right? Whereas the people around him were dressed in suits and ties. So that was not an accident. So yeah, the sartorial politics of Black protest are really an important part of the history for sure.
Yes, thank you. This is one of the rare contributions to this point, to implement this theme. And I think it's very important that as we see folks in pictures, we look at images, to think about their dress is also signaling ideas of their intent and aspiration.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I noticed and wrote about in this photograph, and again, I could be wrong, it's speculative, but the thing that struck me wasn't just the way people were dressed, but the fact that one of the young women, clearly the sharecropper's daughter, one of his daughters, is holding a pencil in the background. And so in the essay, as you'll see, I make a lot of that pencil, and I argue that, the sharecropper, the male head of household, usually, not always, but usually, brought his family's labor to the bargain, as it were. It's a large family, they're all doing the work, but there usually was one member of the family, usually a woman, the wife or the eldest daughter, who had enough education to, help calculate things, to write down what their debt might be to the plantation store, how many goods they had asked for, right? That was power. Now, again, to exert that power was a risk, but when you got to the end of the year and the plantation owner said, well, your family took 12 pounds of bacon this year. So if they wrote it down, they might be able to say, well, maybe, you'd have to be cautious. But the ability to write and keep figures was power. And that was usually power in these families that belonged to women, I think. And so, although I don't think this was a deliberate effort to show that on Shahn's part, because it's just sort of incidental in the background, I thought it was an interesting detail worth noting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for that context. And I'll shift now just to a few questions more general about Black History Month.
Sure.
So we can talk just generally, if you could talk about your first introduction to Black History Month.
Boy, when did Black History Month begin? Do you have any idea, Damarius?
I believe 1924 is the first.
Oh, right, because it's Carter
Negro
Woods.
History Week. Yeah.
I can't really remember. I certainly remember the first time I participated in Black History Month, which was as a young, newly minted assistant professor down in Miami around 1990 or 1991. And I still remember what I said. And I have to be honest, I'm something of a skeptic about Black History Month. Obviously, I think it's good that we have it. But of course, as people will say, well, every month is Black History Month. Why white people get 12 months? Why do we only get one? Right? As Black people will tell you. But again, all joking aside, what I said there, I remember that, is Black History Month is not just for Black people. This is the moment in which white people need to recognize that their Black fellow citizens have made history every bit as much as they have. Essentially, the way I teach US history is there is no way to understand any aspect of US history unless Black history is an integral part of it. So that's why Black History Month is important, not so we can sort of shunt the Black historical experience over here to 1 month. Okay, February's over. Let's move on to Women's History Month. That's good. No, it's to remind us that the Black historical experience is central to the American historical experience, and that you simply cannot even begin to grasp the American historical experience unless you understand the role. To give you one very basic example is, the 14th Amendment, right? So all of our 20th century claims to rights, although being gutted right now, rest on this rewriting of the Constitution that came after the Civil War. And that rewriting, was done by, for, on behalf, and through African-American ideas, resistance, and citizenship. So you can't understand the 14th Amendment unless you understand Black history, which means you can't understand the constitutional history of the 20th century without making African-American history central to your worldview. So that's what I tend to emphasize in Black History Month, and that's why I think it's important. And I'm sure that's what Woodson thought too, but I worry sometimes all too often now it's sort of like, okay, we'll give up these 4 weeks and set it aside. So no, that's not the point. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. It's the shortest month too, right? Of course.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. In the early days, I believe they had a Negro History Week. So I imagine, even the expansion was
progress, right?
Yes,
yeah.
from a certain perspective.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk about if you could maybe elaborate on that sense of skepticism that you noted before, in terms of how you maybe imagine Black History Month has been utilized to kind of shoehorn African American history into a month in ways that you would advise or recommend that educators counteract that.
For K through 12 educators especially, it is important to, on the one hand, to acknowledge Black History Month, because as we've been saying, I mean, it is something that was created by, in many ways, one of the progenitors of African American history, Carter G. Woodson. So it's important to acknowledge it in that regard. Important to acknowledge it because there are some distinctive aspects of the Black experience in the United States that deserve attention in their own right and on their own. Black nationalist history, for example. But at the same time, one wants to avoid this idea that, well, okay, that's just this narrow slice of the American experience. It's just one more group. They get their month, and we can put that aside. It's really, I think Black History Month has to be an opportunity to both emphasize the unique aspects of the Black experience in America, but to take it as an opportunity to ask students to infuse their entire understanding of the American past with that experience, right? And to insist that, this is a history that everyone in the United States needs to know. This isn't a history. So there's a sense that Black History Month is about Black people, and it's also for Black people. That's a mistake, right? It's about Black people, but it's for all Americans, is really, I think, what one needs to emphasize.
Yes, thank you. And that's crucial advice, especially in a period of time when educators are wondering about curriculum and these.
Right. I mean, it's getting harder and harder to teach this stuff, I would think, in a place like Florida. I don't live in Florida anymore, but I know that, from my former colleagues there, not just K through 12, I did work with a lot of K through 12 teachers there, but at the university level, people are sort of, well, how do we teach American history without teaching the history of race and racism? I mean, it's like trying to teach the history of Germany without mentioning the Third Reich. I mean, it just doesn't work.
Yes, absolutely. And for the benefit of our audience, could you maybe call out some names of figures or events or moments from Black history that maybe you couldn't cover in the essay, but would be helpful context that folks should follow up on?
One of the things that was interesting about writing this essay was Ben Shahn, of course, is a white, in fact, Jewish artist and photographer. And as most of but not all of the FSA photographers were indeed white. That said, I've really been digging deeply into the anti-lynching movement of the 1930s, particularly as the protest movement, how artists were using these images of racist violence to advance the anti-lynching cause. So this was actually something close to the heart of the head of the NAACP, Walter White, right, who was a key figure in 1930s politics, connecting sort of, and indeed well aware of what was going on in a place like Arkansas. So connecting the sort of politics of the moment to an effort of the NAACP to combat lynching. And in doing so, he reached out to some really interesting Black artists, not so much photographers now that I think about it, although we can think of Gordon Parks as someone who grows out of this moment and becomes a photographer for Life magazine in the 40s and the 50s. But the Black visual artists, so one that comes to mind that not enough people have heard of is a guy named Hale Woodruff. And Hale Woodruff was really amazing. I believe he's from Atlanta, but anyhow, he does these incredible sort of lithographs of lynching victims. They're very, very powerful. And actually, some of them do hang in the anti-lynching memorial in Montgomery now. So he's doing this artwork in the 30s, Black protest art. The 30s is also a period of muralization, right? So that Black artists, artists of all kinds, are doing murals, public murals, in order to depict the American past. Woodruff was commissioned to do a mural for an HBCU, for a historically Black college in Alabama. And he did so, and the mural he did was of the Amistad Rebellion, which is the famous slave ship rebellion of the 1830s that became an abolitionist cause. So this is a wonderful way that a Black artist doing mural art in the 1930s WPA style reached back into the 19th century canon of African American history, in this case, the Amistad Revolt from the 1830s, right? And depicted it on the wall of a Black college. So that is, for me, a very nice way of connecting the dots between the protest art of the 1930s and the important abolitionist history of the 1830s and 1840s of people, of course, like Frederick Douglass, who I would imagine that most people have heard of, but not that many people have heard of Hale Woodruff. And there are other figures like that in the 1930s who are depicting the Black past, Jacob Lawrence being another very well-known one, actually. And Lawrence is doing paintings in the 30s and the 40s of the Great Migration from the Deep South to places like Chicago, of the Haitian Revolution, turning Toussaint Louverture into sort of a pictorial hero. And a part of that Great Migration series is a very powerful image, panel 15. I just know it because we're doing this anti-lynching art project now that says, and there were lynchings. And that is racist violence was one of the reasons that Black people left places like Mississippi and Arkansas to seek the promised land, as they called it, in places like Chicago or Cleveland or Detroit. Now, as we know from the history, they didn't necessarily find the promised land, but they did find something different and opportunities, and eventually the right to vote and so forth and so on. So Lawrence being a really important artist to the 30s and the 40s, again, I think growing out of the same political moment. Ben Shahn and those photographers are being paid by the Farm Security Administration. Jacob Lawrence, Hale Woodruff, other Black artists are being paid by the Works Progress Administration Arts Project in the mid to late 30s. So this is a moment in which the arts, and not incidentally, I would say, Black history, flourish under the auspices of the federal government. It's a very exciting political and artistic moment. And the subject matter often, not always, but often, is Black life in the rural South. And I think that's, for me, where the dots kind of connect my interests. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask as a follow-up, because I think this is really critical, this connection that you just made between this kind of artistic flourishing of an artistic movement that is also involved in political activism that we might associate with the Black arts movement. So if you could talk about whether this flourishing of artists, of Woodruff, if you would imagine them as progenitors to the Black arts movement, or how you might talk about that, if there's a relationship there.
I mean, in some ways, this is getting beyond my expertise. Yet, I would say, yes, I mean, much the way that I find Shahn and a figure like Ben Shahn intriguing, because he both depicted rural protest movements in Arkansas and then the civil rights movement 30 years later. You can draw a similar line, I think, with African-American artists. So that people like Jacob Lawrence, although not necessarily doing the same kind of work 30, 40 years later, but very much were the mentors for and the progenitors for another generation, the next generation of Black artists that would include, and this is something that's going on in museums everywhere now, it's very exciting, people like Charles White, who starts in the 30s and the 40s, but then also does some amazing images of the civil rights movement 20, 30 years later. So Charles White is someone, again, I would urge educators to look at his artwork. It's really evocative. There's a really powerful one that Charles White does of a returning Black soldier that I think he did in 44 or 45 or 46. It's a really great image to use in the classroom if you're trying to illustrate for students the connection between Black veterans after World War II and the civil rights movement, right? We know that many of the key activists in the civil rights movement in a place like Mississippi, like Medgar Evers or Aaron Henry, had been veterans of World War II or Korea, and were very frustrated because they came back. They've been fighting in a war, the war for democracy, right? The war against fascism, and they get back to Mississippi and it's Jim Crow all over again. And indeed, the GI Bill, the Southern senators tried to block their access to that and so forth. So Charles White captures the visual disappointment of the Black vet in this really powerful image. And so then that follows on through, I would say, to this Black arts movement of the 60s. Elizabeth Catlett is another figure, very, very important from this period, particularly the post-World War II period, who does a whole series of just, again, stunning lithographs about the Black woman, which, again, riffs very nicely on the contemporary politics of the 30s and the 40s and racist violence, lynching, for example, but connects it to Black heroines of the 19th century, such as Harriet Tubman. I suspect many people have seen these images, but for the classroom, this is just such a great way, because to teach and show Black history because it shows this through line that the artists themselves were imagining, connecting the abolitionist movement to Reconstruction, to the 1930s, and then on into the civil rights movement for people like Kerry James Marshall, who's painting in the 70s and 80s. So there is, I think, Damarius, as you're suggesting, a really powerful direct line in the Black arts movement more generally, dating back probably before, but certainly to the 1930s, to people like Woodruff, Lawrence, and Charles White, and then being picked up generation later by Kerry James Marshall and others in the Black arts movement and the Black Power movement. And so there's a wonderful set of photographers in the 1960s from Harlem, the Kaimoingi Project, I think it's called. So these are great tools for teaching, right? Because you can show the students the images, you can connect the photographs in the 30s to the Black arts stuff in the 40s and on through the 60s. This isn't quite what I came to talk about, but it's in my mind because some colleagues and I are trying to trace this out as forms of protest against lynching and how the arts have been used in that regard.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for kind of extending the base beyond the specific imagery that captures the stories about the kind of everyday struggle of life in rural Arkansas. That's really been insightful and very helpful. One final question.
Sure.
But if you could talk about if there's a specific set of connections or relationships that inspired you to join the project, whether it be from Ohio State or from Getty Images, you could talk about that.
The reason I was drawn to this project, to picturing Black history, is, I'm not really a historian of photography, and I'm not really a photographer. I mean, this is something I came to incidentally. But really, for me, my interest in the history of photography and photography as a documentation of Black life came through my interest in South Africa, right? So in particular, as I said at the beginning, I did this book and an exhibit to go with it of the photographs of Margaret Bourke-White, who was one of these photographers in the 1930s, although a commercial photographer, not a WPA photographer, but who traveled through the rural South with the Southern author Erskine Caldwell. And they did a famous or infamous book called You Have Seen Their Faces. And it has its problems, but it's still, in this genre of depicting Southern poverty and life in the late 1930s. But then I discovered that Bourke-White, 12 years later, went to South Africa for Life magazine in 1949 and 1950 and spent 4 months in South Africa and documented life under what was becoming apartheid, the system of extreme segregation in South Africa that sort of was becoming more rigid, even while in places like the United States, it was beginning to show some cracks in its foundations, maybe even crumble, right? So the late 40s, again, one wouldn't want to exaggerate, but it's clear that the tide is running against the Southern segregationists. So for instance, Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces in 1948. This is not something that James Eastland and the senators from the rest of the South were enthusiastic about, to put it mildly. They wanted to impeach Harry Truman. But in South Africa, the tide's running exactly the opposite direction. The most virulent segregationists, the most intense white supremacists are in the driver's seat in South Africa. They win the 1948 election. And that's when Bourke-White goes over there in 1949. So she has this series of absolutely, I think, stunning photographs of Black life in South Africa in 1949, which to my eye mirrored a lot of what she had seen and what her compatriots had seen in the rural South in the 1930s. So this is a very nice way of saying, I come to this project as someone who has been imbued with this comparative eye of US South African history, began as a historian of the rural South. I wrote, for instance, an introduction to a book called Revolt Among the Sharecroppers, which is about Arkansas sharecroppers in 1935, then migrated to South African history in a way, but then through discovering this photographs by Margaret Bourke-White, brought my interest back to the rural South through the eyes of the camera held by Ben Shahn. So for me, it's sort of coming full circle, but my path to visual history very much ran through South Africa, not the United States.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful.